So how are we to read this parable? The commentaries are split and even divisive, almost as split and divisive as America itself. And I would wager it is for some of the same reasons and in some of the same ways. So traditionally, of course, the talents have been read as an instruction to Jesus's disciples that they must use their God-given gifts, their personal gifts as well as their treasury, their talent as well as their talents, that these must be used in the service of God, and that risks must be taken, and that failure to usefully engage with one's gifts will result in negative divine judgment. But readings based on liberation theology turn this on its head, and instead of judging the servant slave, their sympathies are entirely with the enslaved person, with the person who here has been cast into the darkness. And so these readings in turn reject any idea that the master is some kind of equivalent of God or Christ. In this reading, when the slave names the master as exploitive, he is telling the truth. And so in this reading, the servant is punished not for failing to invest his master's money, but he's punished in the way that a whistleblower is punished. He's punished for speaking the truth to an oppressive power. And so when he is cast out, it is not God who is the perpetrator of that cruelty. It is his fellow humanity who refused to see and honor the dignity of others, who chose a myth of autonomy over the realities and the responsibilities of a radical interdependence. In this lens, the parable becomes not some kind of prescription. It becomes more of a snapshot of an existential reality of economic exploitation. My sympathies are with the liberation theology reading, but I find that finally I'm not fully satisfied with either. I find the traditional reading disappointing because it does nothing to go against the grain of the investment analogy. Does God really want the rich to get richer? And isn't there some kind of meaningful difference between the investments of our gifts, the investment of our humanity, and the investment of money? And while I'm generally in sympathy with the liberation theology reading, I find that it disappoints me somewhat too, because I don't see that the Bible gives us parables in order to offer us snapshots of existential realities. I think the parables are here to help us to abandon categories of thought for a new transforming openness. So how could we read this parable differently? Well, I would like to read it by retaining the seriousness of the economic analogy that comes from the first reading, but also insisting on the second reading's alignment with the oppressed. And I think if we look at it from that point of view, we realize that we need to take this story seriously, seriously enough to suggest that the servant did not one right thing, but two right things. What if we begin by believing that he did the right thing not only in naming the exploitation of the master, but in removing that which was trusted to him from circulation in the not so free market? He did something by burying the money in the ground. These readings often pretend like burying money in the ground was to do nothing, but it actually accomplished a lot, that action. In anthropology, there's a concept called inalienable possession. And inalienable possessions are gifts, really, gifts with symbolic and religious power. And because of their symbolic and religious power, they have to be kept out of circulation in the market. They have to be kept out of circulation so that they too don't become a commodity. And this is one of the reasons that food is famously a kind of ultimate gift. Food is consumed. It can't be returned to a monetary economy. And indeed, some cultures even called gifts that are not food, food that you cannot eat. And in this way, gifts are radical. They reject principles of self-interest and instead they strive to create the conditions under which everyone understands that we are constantly indebted to each other and by extension to God. In bearing the money, the servant preserved the understanding that his life is a gift sacred from God, and it is not reducible to market value or personal productivity. In bearing the money trusted to him, he preserved the inalienable worth and dignity of his own humanity. And this is what authentic faith asks of us. Authentic faith does not want us to be busy calculating the worth, the various value of any person. Instead, it asks that we just do the next best thing we can to promote a world where the gap between an idea of universal, inalienable worth and what actually happens in the world is just a little less enormous. So I'm saying these words calmly now, but the fact of the matter is I can get really impatient with the work that is left to do. And it's been a hard week for me that way. As I listened to the election results of this week, any temptation to celebrate was well tempered by the obvious evidence that our nation is so seriously divided. And yet we need to remember that disappointment shouldn't cause us to not see and recognize the many manifestations of beauty, justice, and truth that are present with us. We have done a lot this week. Friends, we have the first female vice president, and she's a Black woman with deep ties to India, and her team received more votes than any other in American history. Voter turnout was enormous. We've seen greater representation for LGBTQ folks, both nationally and in some local areas than we have before. And oh my gosh, how beautiful is the Stacey Abrams story? How beautiful is it that rather than rest in the bitterness of the election that was stolen from her, she actually worked tirelessly to stop voter suppression. We need to send Stacey Abrams lots of flowers, and we need to start now, and we need to keep at it. So there really are signs that the soul of our country is still intact. On Thursday night, I was listening to the election coverage by flipping back and forth, as is often my habit, between MSNBC and Fox News. And when Trump came on and he stood in front of the White House podium and he said that he had won the election if you don't count the illegal votes, something amazing happened. For once, the commentary on MSNBC and Fox News was exactly the same. The president was lying. And I loved how MSNBC handled the coverage of that speech. They broke away from it almost immediately to return to an interview with a deeply minor election official. I loved that. I loved hearing from that minor official in that moment, a reminder that there were hundreds of thousands of citizen poll workers, elections officials of both parties and all walks of life who, rather than spend this time ranting and raving, were diligently and honestly counting votes with the care and the respect that is due democracy's highest sacrament. So we might not have yet arrived at the age of complete respect, but perhaps we can glimpse it from here. Sometimes I know it's hard to know what our faith calls us to do or to be in the political sphere. And sometimes I know it's hard to be confused about where the interests of the nation stop or start and how they do or don't correlate with the tenets of our religion or even the still small voices of our own conscience. We disagree, even vehemently, about these things among ourselves. But today, I'm comforted in finding a complete congruence between our spiritual convictions and our public duty. To paraphrase Marilyn Robinson, Barack Obama's favorite contemporary American thinker, if America is an idea, that idea is that human beings are sacred and they are therefore equal. Both our Constitution and our Holy Scripture dare us to see each other in the light of an inalienable worth and dignity. We got this. We got what it takes for the next stage of the journey. We are bound together in love and in sacred promise. We are indebted.